In the late 1980s, women's wrestling was in an odd position in the business. The Moolah, midgets and girls era of hair mares and dropkicks was over. But the WWF was only half-heartedly utilizing women wrestlers. The NWA/WCW really wasn't featuring women's wrestling at all. And then there was Glow, the syndication sensation that finally put women's wrestling at the forefront, although it wasn't presented as a serious athletic endeavor. That's where today's topic comes in. A promotion that presented women as athletes, as tough and strong wrestlers. This is Defunct Championship Wrestling, Episode 15, the Ladies Professional Wrestling Association, the LPWA. Now, to really set the stage for the story and the importance of LPWA, we do need to take a quick look back at the history of women's wrestling. Pro wrestling has featured women's matches as far back as the 1930s and 1940s, Mildred Burke being the biggest star of that era. The invention of television brought pro wrestling into the homes of millions across the country. Along with that exposure came new female stars, like Penny Banner, June Byers, Ethel Johnson, and of course, Mae Young in the Fabulous Moolah. It would be Moolah who would control women's wrestling for the better part of 30 years. Her and her husband at the time, Buddy Lee, trained and booked the girls throughout the NWA territories, usually only advertised along the bottom of event posters, plus midgets and girls being the phrase. The Moolah era of women's wrestling in the 60s and 70s wasn't exactly known for its work rate. It was all very standard basic wrestling. They weren't allowed to have a match that would outshine the men, even though many were very capable of doing so. Vivian Vachon, Donna Christianello, and Joyce Grable being just three who come to mind. Even if they weren't really allowed to show it, the women of the time were ultra tough for sure. They had to be in order to survive in the business in that day. It's been alleged that abuse, assault, and overall mistreatment was rampant. Any woman that wanted to do more in the ring or just get out from under Moolah's thumb saw themselves either out of the business entirely or journeying to Japan like Sandy Parker, who found great success in All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling. All Japan Women's has a long and storied history that I will no doubt cover in depth down the line. But it was AJW that would really raise the quality of women's wrestling. Wrestling in Japan has always been viewed more as sport than entertainment. Athleticism over theater. And that was no different with the women. They hit harder, took riskier bumps, and made their matches feel incredibly realistic. We're skipping ahead in the timeline a bit here, but Manami Toyota is one of the most influential wrestlers of all time. Period. Male, female, doesn't matter. Come the mid-80s, wrestling was again booming thanks to cable television and the WWF's Rock and Wrestling Connection, which was centered, at least early on, around the Women's Championship. A new crop of women like Velvet McIntyre, Leilani Kai, Judy Martin, and the WWF Women's Champion Wendy Richter all came to prominence around this time. Wendy's pairing with pop star Cyndi Lauper would also see the Women's Championship match become one of the main attractions for the first WrestleMania. The Rock and Wrestling Connection also inspired a lot of others in the entertainment industry to capitalize on the wrestling boom, including David McLean. McLean is a fascinating television producer and actually got his start in wrestling working for Dick the Bruiser's WWA. In 1986, he launched Glow, Gorgeous Ladies of Wrestling. It was the first all-female pro wrestling show on television. Glow combined comedy, popular music, and wrestling with all that 1980s flair that we love. It was a major hit on syndication and really for the first time in the US, put women at the forefront with actual larger-than-life characters. The majority of the women on Glow were not wrestlers prior to being cast on the show, something that the Netflix series captured very well. We'll also talk about Glow more in depth in the future as well. This national focus on women's wrestling wouldn't last, however. By 1989, Glow was coming to an end, and the WWF was losing interest in the division even after introducing tag team titles and bringing in the Jumping Bomb Angels from Japan. but their loss could be someone else's gain. That someone would be former AWA Las Vegas promoter Tor Berg. I can find zero video or pictures of the man, so instead let's use the boss from Dinosaurs. This supposedly wasn't Berg's first attempt at a women's wrestling promotion. In 1986, he started Women's Championship Wrestling with partner Joseph Infante. Berg may not have been the most honest promoter in the business. There's a story that while touring in Houston, the bus driver refused to drive the girls to the arena unless he got paid first. Berg allegedly sent his bodyguard onto the bus to intimidate the wrestlers into donating to pay the bus company, either because Berg didn't have the money or because he just flat out didn't want that money to come out of his pocket. I know, a wrestling promoter being a cheap and shady asshole? Who would have thought? The concept failed in 1987 after a pilot was never picked up, although they were able to release it on home video. Well, anyway, in September of 1989, Tor Berg launched his all-new, all-women's wrestling promotion, the Ladies Professional Wrestling Association. Glow was nearing the end of its run, but was still airing at the time and was still probably what most people thought of when they'd hear women's wrestling. So how would Berg set his promotion apart? Well, easy, by focusing on wrestling. The LPWA would be a serious women's wrestling program. It wouldn't feature the same kind of comedy sketches or hire actresses or showgirls. They would employ majority pro wrestlers, both established names and newcomers. Newer talents like Bambi, Heidi Lee Morgan, Malia Hosaka, and Georgia Brown, the future Jackie Moore. They had established former WWF names like the Glamour Girls, Leilani Kai and Judy Martin, as well as the former world champion, Wendy Richter. LPWA even brought in former Glow and AWA names Tina Moretti, the future Ivory, and Medusa Michelli, the future Alundra Blaze. Even Miss Linda gets a few matches, which means we also get exotic Adrian Street on the show. Fantastic. But I've saved my favorite two for last. Terry Power, who would later become one of my favorites of the Attitude Era, Tori, and the incredibly underrated Reggie Bennett. Bennett was a one-of-a-kind talent, especially for the time. She wasn't some diminutive woman that would kick and punch. Reggie was a big, strong, agile badass who you could easily drop into the 2024 national scene and let her have some banger matches. Reggie Bennett and Terry Power were also a frequent tag team in Japan for JWP, Japan Women Pro Wrestling. And if you're looking to present a more serious, realistic women's wrestling product, it'd probably be a good idea to bring in some women from Japan. So that's exactly what Berg and LPWA did, as the promotion would see many talents from JWP eventually appear for the company. But there's more to a wrestling presentation than just the wrestlers. Over the course of its existence, LPWA would have commentary by Joe Pedicino, Sergeant Slaughter, Ken Resnick, Chris Cruz, Nick Bockwinkel, and Jim Cornette. I saw some suggestions that Cornette had also booked LPWA at some point, but I couldn't find anything to confirm that 100%. The show also had Bonnie Blackstone on backstage interviews. With the roster and other roles set, it was now time for their first TV taping, which they would film in December 1989 at the sold-out Riverside Hotel and Casino in Laughlin, Nevada. LPWA produced two different series simultaneously, the 1-hour Super Ladies of Wrestling and the 30-minute Ladies Championship Wrestling. The shows aired both in syndication and on regional sports channels like NESN, the Sunshine Network, and of course, Sports Channel America stations. The production quality of the show is fine. It's similar to Herb Abrams' UWF, but unlike UWF, the action in the ring is really good pretty consistently in my opinion. They had the Inside LPWA segment hosted by Barbie that was a lot like the WWF Control Center, so that was pretty good. And over time, the ring itself vastly improves, from a ring with boxing ropes to a proper wrestling ring. Early episodes have a PBR sponsorship smack dab in the middle of the canvas. Better than other sponsorships, I'd say. There's an awful lot I like about the way the show is presented. It's very watchable and I enjoyed a lot of it. The majority of 1990, I cannot find a thing about their taping schedule or financial situation or anything. I've looked around at the summarized versions of the Observer issues from the time, and LPWA isn't mentioned. So if Dave did have anything to say about the promotion in 1990, I'm not paying him $12.99 to find out. We know there was another taping, I believe in Laughlin, Nevada again, but this time at the Colorado Bell Casino Resort. So let's say they were seeing some success financially. But let's skip ahead to September of 1990, because some very interesting things happened. Sheik Adnan El-Kaisi signed with the WWF to come in and join a newly heel Sergeant Slaughter. But this was only after agreeing to a deal with and appearing for LPWA. Reportedly, Berg had every legal right to sue, but didn't because he wanted to have open relations with the WWF. Did he really think there may have been an opportunity for some sort of working agreement? Was he just trying to avoid the cost of a legal battle with Vince? Not sure, but it's very interesting that he just let it go if it's true. On September 5th, LPWA had a match featured on WCW's Clash of the Champions 12, where Susan Sexton defeated Bambi to retain the LPWA Championship. That's great exposure. The show scored a 4.7 rating on TBS. Not earth-shattering, but a bigger audience than they were probably getting in syndication. In January 1991, LPWA hosted a third taping in Laughlin, Nevada. This taping would see the crowning of a new LPWA champion, as Lady X defeated Susan Sexton in a 2 out of 3 falls match. It's been just over a year since the company launched and things were going pretty smoothly. But the fortunes were about to take a turn as Tor Berg was about to show his true colors. Looking to add some more international names to the roster, Berg reached out to one half of the Jumping Bomb Angels, Noriyo Tateno. He offered her a permanent roster spot in LPWA if she retired from All Japan Women's and moved to the US. Tateno accepted the offer, and on March 17, 1991, she had her retirement match. According to some in attendance, it was a touching spectacle the likes of which Kokorian Hall had never seen before. By all accounts, Tateno was excited to start this new chapter of her career. A new challenge that she was ready to face. However, almost right after the match was over, she received a call from Berg telling her that he wasn't going to be using her after all, so don't even bother coming to the US. Tateno sat in the locker room, surrounded by her family and massive bouquets of flowers, and sobbed. Why? Why would Tor Berg do this? Did he make a promise he couldn't fulfill and was too big of a coward to take it back until the last minute? Maybe he thought he'd have the money to do it, but it never came through? Did he have some sort of vendetta against her and this was his way of trying to ruin her career? There doesn't seem to be an answer. As far as I can tell, she didn't wrestle again until November of '92, when with the help of Sherry Martel, she was finally able to get bookings again. Sherry was said to be enraged by what Tor Berg did to Tateno. She badmouthed him every chance she got and urged others not to work for him. But we'll see who gets the last laugh here. In June of 1991, they taped some more TV. And a fun story from this taping is apparently during Medusa's match, Joe Pedicino called her loony on commentary.
Look at this in the world! Medusa threw her halfway across the ring. She may be loony, but she's got some of the greatest moves I have ever seen in wrestling.
After the match, Medusa caught wind of the comment. As payback on her next match out, she threw a whipped cream pie at Pedicino. Looked like a rib to me. Joe seemed to be having a good time. But it really doesn't help her case for not being loony. Things started to really take a downturn in August of 1991 when the promotion canceled all future tapings after a financial backer dropped out. Allegedly, LPWA's syndication company won a judgment against Tor Berg, which caused them to freeze all assets in the company, and Berg's investors pulled out. Now what that judgment was regarding, I can't find anything specific. Berg probably tried to screw them on something. September and October came and went with no events announced while they were still waiting for financing. Thankfully, they came into funding in December and were able to tape TV in Jackson, Tennessee. The January 1992 tapings in Raleigh, North Carolina were canceled due to lack of funds. But they did announce that they'd be running a pay-per-view scheduled for February 23rd. Over the next couple of weeks, there was huge speculation on whether or not the show would happen at all. There were also questions of where the show would take place. as Hammond, Indiana, Jackson, Tennessee, and Laughlin, Nevada had all been rumored. And when it would happen was also up in the air. It was suggested at one time that the show would be pre-taped and aired the next night. Eventually, LPWA were able to settle on going ahead with the show. Super Ladies Showdown would air live on pay-per-view from the Mayo Civic Center in Rochester, Minnesota. The event was expected to bomb, and it met those expectations. Live attendance was a sparse 400 people, allegedly all giveaways, and the buy rate was less than UWF Beach Brawl the year before. That show was only purchased by 2,000 homes. Super Ladies Showdown was purchased by 1,000 or less. Which is a shame because the show itself, the wrestling, wasn't that bad. It was quality action for the time. The problem there may have been the price of the show. I'm not sure who sets the prices for pay-per-views, but the price here was $19.99. $20 for a show that most people may not have been aware of. I don't really think people were willing to pay $20 for a women's wrestling show in 1992, no matter how good it was. The prevailing opinion at the time was that women's wrestling wasn't as good as men's wrestling. Now sure, women's wrestling in 1992 wasn't nearly as good as what we have now, but even by 1992 standards, I think this show deserved more of a chance. The big hook of the pay-per-view was a tournament for the LPWA Japanese Championship, which is where that JWP partnership finally comes in. Ultimately, Harley Sato from JWP would be crowned champion, and Terry Power won the LPWA Championship. All good news. There was a rumor of a mixed tag match pitting Eddie Gilbert and Candy Devine versus the Patriot and Misty Blue, a little GWF crossover, but the match didn't happen. During the event, they actually announced a follow-up pay-per-view emanating from Tokyo that summer. More on that later. And the worst part of this whole ordeal was when some Northeast cable companies pulled the plug on the show because it went over time just as the main event was beginning. So even if someone bought the show, they couldn't see the main event. LPWA announced a TV taping for July of 1992, but as had become the custom, it was cancelled. And that would be the end of the Ladies Professional Wrestling Association. No Tokyo pay-per-view in the summer, no more TV after producing 208 episodes between their two shows. Tor Berg had failed again. Berg would make a third attempt at a women's wrestling promotion in 1999 with the Women's National Wrestling Alliance in partnership with the NWA. It also failed, but we'll discuss that another time. He also tried to relaunch LPWA in 2000, but it never happened. He also supposedly was trying to start a women's MMA show in 2011. It never came to be, as he would pass away in March of 2011 of a ruptured colon. Many of the women from LPWA would land in the WWF and WCW at various times, find steady work on the indies, some would return to Japan as regulars, and others would leave the business behind entirely. Noriyo Tateno, however, would wrestle in Japan for another 18 years after she was tricked into retirement. Good for her. The legacy of LPWA would carry on a little longer as the LPWA title would be defended on some Eddie Sharkey PWA cards in 1992. The LPWA TV would be licensed globally well into the 2000s, creating new fans along the way. A 24-volume VHS collection titled the Home Video Collector Series was released throughout the 1990s, and in May of 2010, the new owners of the footage launched allwomenwrestling.com, where you can purchase digital copies of the collector series for a healthy sum. Or like, I don't know, maybe you're already visiting a website that has a vast selection of pro wrestling for you to peruse? Maybe even LPWA? It's on YouTube. I'm saying it's here on YouTube. There's tons of it. Check it out. There's a lot of good stuff. The LPWA, no matter how good it was in the ring, was destined to fail as long as Tor Berg was running things. He was as dishonest a promoter as they come. They had so many stars of the future that maybe were getting pushed too early? One criticism of LPWA, even at the time, was that they weren't pushing the established names. And that's not even my observation, that was Luna Vachon saying that in '91. And she's not wrong. You had Wendy Richter, but she was never the LPWA champion. I can't think of anything that could have saved LPWA. Maybe a different owner? Better or more consistent TV distribution? Not sure. Today, the LPWA is remembered fondly by those that discovered it through television, and the many more who are discovering it now thanks to the internet. And clearly their talents have inspired many of the women working today. Times have changed in the 30+ years since their last event. Women in the ring have only gotten better. The women of the 2000s were better than the women of the 90s. And the women of today are better than the women of the 2000s. It's a trend that's only going to continue, in my opinion. Today, it's not just 2 or 3 women's promotions running. As of this video in 2024, there's more than a dozen active women's promotions around the globe. If you haven't checked out any LPWA and you're a fan of any of the women on the roster, I highly suggest you give it a watch. As always, if you have any Defunct suggestions for this series, drop them in the comments, as well as any thoughts you may have about the LPWA. I'm Scott from WrestleSpective. Watch wrestling, love wrestling. Thanks for watching.